Alright guys, new video, new unit. It's time for us to talk about law. Moral law, physical law, the laws that governments impose, the laws that the church imposes. You guys get the idea. So let's start off with actually defining what a law is, okay? So we've got the word law, alright? Now a law is something that imposes some sort of necessity on those that it affects. Alright, now what do I mean by that? Like, let's say the laws of gravity. You are physically and inextricably bound to obey the laws of gravity, alright? If I jump up, I must come down. Now, not all laws are created with that sort of physical, inextricable bond. The moral law, for example, let's write that down. The moral law. Okay, there's two general types of laws that we're going to be covering right here. We've got the moral law, and we've got the physical law. So like we just discussed, the physical law implies a physical necessity. Physical necessity. Now the moral law implies a moral necessity, okay? Now, because that is not something material, you are not required to obey it, all right? Because the natural law, the divine law, all of the different moral laws are known within the nature of every human person, your intellect is necessarily bound to respect the moral law. Now, that's the key word there. Respect. Not follow, okay? Every rational human being, meaning mental illness aside, every rational human being respects the moral law, respects do good, avoid evil. Alright, now let's start and try to move to a more broader definition of the word law. Okay, so a law is, let me get the list right here. It is an ordinance. It is reasonable. It is for the common good. It is promulgated. We'll get into what that means in just a moment. And it is imposed by someone in charge. Alright, so let's start with that first guy, ordinance. What does ordinance mean? Okay? Ordinance effectively states that a law is compelled. It is mandatory. It's not a suggestion. Okay? Let's go back to our example of the laws of physics. Gravity is not a suggestion. You need to obey the laws of gravity. Reasonable. What does it mean when a law is reasonable? Okay? A reasonable law is something that is enforceable. A reasonable law is something that is effective. And a reasonable law is something that can feasibly achieve the goal that it wants to achieve. For example, let's say a certain mayor of New Hyde Park would want to decrease the speed limit on the freeways. So, first of all, ordinance, not a suggestion, he would put up signs that's saying it is unlawful to go above, let's say, 50 miles an hour. Okay? It's unlawful. You're going to get arrested. You're going to get fined, whatever the punishment may be. All right? That's it being not a suggestion. It being reasonable is that it could reasonably be enforced, and it can reasonably accomplish its goal. Saying people will get fined for going above the speed limit means it's probably going to accomplish its goal. But how do you enforce it? Let's say you station speed traps, speed cameras, detect speed by radar. So it also needs to be for the common good. Let's go back to our 50 mile per hour example. For the common good, driving below 50 miles an hour would mean that it's now safer on the roads, less people are getting injured, Maybe it's easier to get a license now because it's less dangerous, less experience is needed, etc., etc. Okay, it's for the common good. Something that's not for the common good would be dedicating a parking spot in the mall to your friend. Okay? That would be benefiting one person. It would not be benefiting the vast majority of people who obey the law. Okay? Promulgated. Now, promulgated is another way of saying that something becomes well known. Okay? The mayor can't make a new law and not announce it to everyone. Okay? You can't enforce a law that nobody knows about. You can't illegalize socks, not tell anyone, and suddenly arrest half the population. Promulgated needs to be well known. Alright? That's why we have our 50-mile-per-hour signs on the highway. Okay? They can't fine you for going above 50 miles an hour if they didn't put up a series of signs, series of warnings. And then the last one, it needs to be done by someone in charge. Okay? You, as a citizen, cannot make laws. You can suggest that laws be made, but ultimately you don't have the final say in whether a law is set into effect as an ordinance. Alright? Mayor, president, God, your parents. These are all people that can make laws pertaining to you. I don't think any of you people are God, because obviously God does not have to obey laws, temporal laws, set on the floor by human people, by human hands. Now that brings us to another distinction. Exactly how many different types of laws are there? I just used one word right now, temporal law. What is a temporal law? Let's get into it. Okay, so we generally segregate laws into three different categories, okay? We categorize them based off of their duration, we categorize them based off of their origin, and we categorize them based off of how they've been promulgated. Okay, so duration. You have the temporal law, and you have the eternal law. So as you guys may guess, the temporal law is temporary, the eternal law is eternal. Now, as you also may guess, the eternal law is everything that has been created by God. So, for example, the laws of nature, the laws of physics, really anything that we have no power over, that we cannot control, that we cannot change, that we cannot disobey. Alright? We cannot disobey the eternal law, because the eternal law is a reflection of God's image on the world, because the eternal law has been created by God. Now, as opposed to that, temporal law are types of laws that are temporary, that can be changed, that can be disobeyed. Not that they should be disobeyed, but because you have free will, you have the physical capability to disobey them. These would be like civil law. Laws that mayors of New Hyde Park would make. We've got laws, ecclesiastical law, which is like laws made by the church. Yes, that's temporal law. That's made by human hands. Okay? Let's say the church says, you need to fast during Lent. You, as a human person, have the physical capability to ignore that law and not fast during Lent. Not that you should do that, but there you go. So when we talk about origin, we've got two pretty distinct cuts as to where origin is different. So we've got human origin. It's terrible handwriting. You've got human origin, and you've got divine origin or from God. Okay? So you can pretty much see the clear-cut distinctions here. Humans are able to make temporal laws, eternal laws are made by God, the natural law. All right, you can see the distinction here. And then we have how they've been promulgated. Now this is an interesting discussion, okay? So you can have things that have been promulgated positively, meaning there was effort put into making them well known, signs were put up, broadcasts were made, warnings were made. That's positive promulgation, okay? And you can imagine that goes hand in hand with temporal and human law. Because only laws we make need to be made known to everyone. But then you have natural promulgation. Now what that means is that the eternal law, the natural law, are laws that every rational person with wisdom will learn, will know, will have deep in their nature already known. Okay? You have this sort of moral compass in you, imparted onto you once you reach the age of reason. Now sometimes in our life we may come across a civil law, a law made by people, a law made by the government, that contradicts divine law, that contradicts eternal law. All right? What do we do then? Which law do we follow? Well, obviously there's an eternal law for a reason. Okay? And the temporal law is something that can be changed. Okay? If you're lucky enough to live in a democracy, you have the power to change civil law. Now, we would call a civil law like that unreasonable. Unreasonable. Okay? Now, that's something that we defined up here. If a law is not reasonable, it's not a law. Therefore, you are not obliged to follow such a civil law that is in contradiction to the eternal law, because we've just stated it's no longer a law. If it's unreasonable, you are not bound to it. Henry David Thoreau, Civil Disobedience. There you go. Now this can also apply to our acts. Our acts as human beings. Our norms as human beings. So when our acts contradict the norms, we would consider that to be a disordered act. Because let's go back to this idea of order. The entire world, every single human, everything in the universe abides by the order which God set it in. Okay? This order in the universe is a reference to the eternal law up here. Alright? If your acts are not in accordance with the eternal law, they are disordered. They do not abide by the set of norms that the universe works by. Sin is a disordered act. God did not create the world to be full of evil. Brings us back to this. Do good, avoid evil. This is how God built the world. But we all know that we sin, okay? We all know we do that. We have reconciliation for specifically that reason. But some of us decide to sin for several reasons, actually. But one of the one is my favorite is a reason called rationalization. Rationalization is when you know something's wrong, you do it anyway, because you have convinced yourself and you have convinced others that it's not evil at all. It was good. Okay? Rationalization is finding a good reason to have done something evil, to have done a disordered act. Okay? A good example of rationalization. So, boss, Tommy over here has been giving us some trouble lately, okay? He hasn't been paying his dues. He was no longer a good investment for us, boss. You see, so we had to put him down. Killing people is obviously a disordered act. Okay, if you try to rationalize it by saying the guy had it coming, that doesn't make it any less a disordered act. You're just trying to rationalize you doing that disordered act. You've also got things like denial. Denial is when you do something wrong, but you're convinced it's good. You think it's good. Denial is me having a diet, me trying to pursue a good of the body, which is health, and then me going over to Dunkin' Donuts, buying half a dozen and eating them all on my way home. Okay? When I get home, I'm going to reflect back on that, and I'm going to say to myself, yeah, but I always eat donuts. You know, everyone always eats donuts. I love donuts. It can't be that bad to eat donuts, right? Let me eat some more donuts. That's denial. It wasn't really wrong what I did. So therefore I can keep doing it. You see, the difference between denial and rationalization is denial means never acknowledging it was wrong. Rationalization means I know it's wrong, but I did it for a good reason. Okay, so moving on past this, we have two more little terms, okay? We have rights, and we have duties, okay? Now, you guys can probably paint in your picture in your mind of what exactly these things are. So, a right is something that you are entitled to. A right is something in accordance with the moral law that you must respect. A good example is paying your workers a good wage, paying your workers enough to live. Okay, minimum wage. I'm looking at you, China. Minimum wage. Duties and rights go hand in hand. Okay? You have a right to a minimum wage. Therefore, those in power, aka your employer, your boss, those in power, have a duty to pay you a minimum wage. Okay? They exist as a duality. You have a right to life, and everyone else in the community has a duty not to kill you. Okay? Your duties and your rights all correspond to this thing, the law. Alright? There is a law that says, you shall not kill. Everyone has a duty to obey the law, and everyone has a right to protection under the law. If a law says, do not steal, like in the Ten Commandments, you have a duty to follow the law, and I have a right to not get my stuff stolen under the protection of the law. Alright guys, really appreciate you tuning in. Hope you learned something. As always, enjoy life.